I'm Bob Turner, and I write books about transportation history. And I'm very interested in British Columbia's past and present, and the history of many other parts of the world too. And I particularly try and find out about how we moved around, what our transportation and communication systems have been for many years, but particularly the last 150 or so, from the period of the use of steam railways and steamships. People ask me how I got interested in these things, and it goes back a long way. My first book was about Vancouver Island's railways, and it was published in 1973 when I was came out just after I finished university. But what got me on that project was going to the library and not being able to find out that part of our history. And I had an interest in railways and photography at that time, and one thing led to another, and I thought very foolishly that I'd write a book about it, not knowing half of what I was getting myself into. And a few years later, and eventually it did indeed happen, and it captures your imagination. It's like enjoying a particular kind of puzzle or game, whether it's golf or tennis, that's challenging and keeps you on edge, and you feel there's always more to do. And the photography, you feel you can always take better pictures. So you never really satisfy yourself with that. And I often get asked what sort of material I use and where do I get it. So I have a few samples to show you. One of the key sources of information are early newspapers. They're often saved nowadays on microfilm, which you can print out. Okay. And one of the really good sources for basic information about how the railways operated, and the steamships too, and the stagecoach lines like the BX Express that went up to the Caribou, they had timetables. They tried to run on time because they didn't have radio communications or anything like that. And of course it was very helpful for passengers to know when the train might come. These give you all sorts of information, and there were timetables that were made for employees that gave far more details than the ones that were made just for passengers. So this is an example from the 1920s from the Esquimalt and Nanaimo Railway, but it lists all of the freight services that the railway offered as well, and the approximate running times of the freight trains, which gives you an idea of how long it would take to get your goods delivered and things like that. But it also told the train crews where they were going to meet another train, what the operating conditions and restrictions were, gave speed limits for going across the Johnson Street Bridge or the trestles that were in the mountains. But these were really good sources. And you'll also find things like passenger tariffs, which tell you how much it costs to ride the train, which is always interesting. Maybe $1 to go from Victoria to Duncan in the old days. Also, if you can ever find them, dining car menus that are wonderful and exciting to see what was being served in the very posh CPR dining cars or the Canadian National ones, or on the steamships too. The catering department was really important to the service these companies offered. And it's just like today, it made a big difference to how much you enjoyed your travels if you had nice food along the way. One of my favorites is a document like this, which is a great profile. This one happens to be from the Canadian National's line on Vancouver Island, and if you unrolled this like a scroll, it would go on for 6 or 7 feet. But it gives you an enormous amount of material about the characteristics of that section of railway, which is now hiking trail and cycling trail. But this sort of engineering information gives you really good insight into where in the old days industries were located, sawmills, box factories, creameries, where farmers might ship their produce out. All these things were noted on these profiles, as were where there were bridges and trestles and road crossings. So it's also a really interesting record if like in the case of the CN lines, it's going to become a hiking trail, because it helps you visualize what it was like maybe a century before. I've been to China more times than I probably should have been. I've enjoyed it immensely, and China has been one of the great strongholds of steam power, but it's virtually gone by the beginning of 2013. I was there in December at a place called Sanderling, which is probably the biggest concentration of steam engines anywhere in the world now. At Sanderling, one of the real privileges was spending time with quite a few of the coal miners. And each morning, and in wintertime, it's before sunrise, there's a miner's train that leaves from one end of the big mining operation to the other, taking the workers. So I was able to ride with the workers on several days when it was about -20 and still dark. And everybody would come into these two converted boxcars that had little stoves at each end. That was the only light, it was the only heat. And everybody would just cluster around the stove and try and keep warm until they got to the other end of this jolting, rattling 10-mile train ride, and then they would go off to their work. And the other miners coming off shift would get back on the train, or get on the train and ride it back the other way. It was so nice being able to get to know people. There's a language barrier, of course, but it's surprising how much you can communicate even if you can't say a lot in the same language. I was able to meet people in the machine shops and in the workshops and ride with some of the crews in the locomotives, and they would show me how they ran their machines, and it was the same thing they were doing that people were doing in British Columbia, in the Rockies or the Selkirks or in the Kootenays or on Vancouver Island half a century or even 100 years ago. Pretty special opportunity.